Everybody, welcome back to October Sky, Chapter 7, Part 3. Okay. On Sunday, Mom and Jim got up, as usual, and dressed to go to church. Dad also came down the steps, decked out in a suit and tie. Mom could not have been more astonished if he had appeared naked. It turned out Mr. Van Dyke asked him to attend a bunch of clubhouse meetings and church service. Well, la-di-da, Mom said. Aren't we fancy? Dad frowned at her and said, Elsie, I've got to. We're both there. Mom pushed me ahead, straightened my tie with one hand around my neck. I'll think about it, she said, and I could almost hear Dad's teeth grind. Mom and Dad sat in the back of church between the Van Dykes and Mr. and Doc and Mrs. Lassiter. Jim sat with the football boys, still grumpy about being kicked out of the state championship. I found Sherman and Odell, and we all sat in front. When the choir got up to sing, Mrs. Dancer stepped out for a solo. She stood straight and tall in her maroon robe, and when the sun came through the glass window, her hair glowed like molten silver. When she finished, her voice seemed to be singing, still ringing up in the rafters. The Reverend Lanier stood up and made his way to the pulpit. I thought something about him didn't look right. He looked a little harried. His robe seemed to be not fitting. His hair needed to be combed. Today, he began, in a nervous voice, we'll be talking about fathers and sons. Okay. I'm going to skip through all of this, basically through this part of the book. He talked about dads need to support their family, sons are part of the family. All in all, dads support your sons. Even if it goes against your best judgment, you never know what good things could come out of your boys reaching for the stars. Wink, wink. Amen, the great six rumbled. Sherman, Odell, and I looked at one another and grinned. I heard furious whispering among the football boys, but behind us were our parents. There was nothing but stone-cold silence. Reverend Lanier looked instantly there and wiped the sweat off his forehead. With the blousey sleeve of his robe, a moment before he seemed to be lifted high above the congregation, carried aloft by his rhetoric. Now, perhaps by the reaction he was receiving from certain individuals behind me, he was back on earth. Of course, this is just the poor preacher's opinion, he said in a shaky voice, eyes darting. Choir, you can go now. Reverend Lanier sat down, hiding behind the pulpit, but the choir stood up and sang Faith of Our Fathers with special enthusiasm. Afterward, Reverend was supposed to get up and give the blessing, but he stayed seated. After a moment of hesitation, Mr. Dancer, who had been elected the company church deacon for the year, rose and asked for somebody to wait until the choir finished outside. I turned around and saw Dad and Mr. Van Dyke looking sour. Mom and Mrs. Van Dyke had angelic smiles on their faces. As the great six filed by, they gave the Rocket Boys stern looks, which we knew what that meant. They'd gone on a limb for us. We better do well with what our plans are. Jim and most of the other football teams went off down the street. Is it so, Odell? Is it so? Odell made it take off his jacket. Come on, big boy. I'll show you who's a sister. So this is where the Rocket Boys and the football boys are going to get in a little tussle. Mom came out of church at that moment and saw what was afoot. Hello, Buchanan, she said to Buck. Hello, Mrs. Hickman, he said, straightening his tie and his posture at once. How are you today? Fine, Mr. Buchanan, and you? Just fine, the big boy said. He looked at us threateningly and then trudged off behind the other football boys who were gathering at the big store steps. Odell and Sherman took off after in opposite directions, leaving me with Mom. She said, Why don't you wait here a minute, Sonny? I think your dad would like to talk to you. Then she walked with Mrs. Van Dyke towards the clubhouse. I looked over at the parking area and saw Dad and Mr. Van Dyke standing around the Colwood teachers. Then they broke free. Really? I was delighted at the prospect. Usually I had to beg him to get a practice session. He slumped in the passenger seat. Go towards Frog Lake. This is where Dad is letting Sonny drive. The drive was quiet, with me carefully steering while Dad said little except grumbling when I accidentally hit a pothole. When we reached the Frog Level camp, he nodded towards the dirt road which led down through the wilderness area that we called Big Branch. I took it even more carefully on the rutted clay lest the big Buick might lose its oil pan. 2 miles further down the road, he told me to stop. An abandoned slack dump. Let's take a look here, he said. We walked on the gritted surface of the dump. Bulldozers had flattened a million times of coal trailings to create a black desert that stretched from a narrow valley. If you were to fire off any more rockets, here's the place, Dad said. Nobody in town can see or hear you from here. I gaped at the huge black space. How long is it? About a mile, more or less. I peered down the sun-blackened dump, and then at the surrounding mountains, my imagination clicking over and overdrive. I could see everything and how it was going to be. The blockhouse, the launch pad, the rockets blasting up. Cape Colwood, I breathed. Dad looked around at the barren slack and then shook his head. If you want this place, you're the only one. Let's go. Dad, there's just one thing. What's that? I felt reckless. We need a building, a blockhouse, it's called, so we can go for protection when our rockets launch. Do you have some lumber so we could build one? Dad took off his gentleman's fedora and tapped it on his leg. Company property is for company business, not for building rockets. Strap lumber will do, I explained, sensing that this was my moment. And we can have some for the roof? Dad plodded back to the car and then turned and pointed at me. If I get you this scrap, even scrap is expensive, young man. If I do this, then from here on, I want the rocket business out of my sight, out of mind, out of Colwood. You understand? Yes, sir. Thank you. Dad perched his fedora on his head. He looked relieved, and then anxiety played across his face. Let's go, he said urgently. God knows what stories your mother is telling Van Dykes. I looked back over my shoulder at the vast slack dump. I followed as my father went back to the car. The BCMA finally had a home. Cape Colwood. I couldn't wait to tell Quentin. Very exciting news for the BCMA. Hopefully here we'll see what kind of rockets they can build.